All right, so in this video, we're going to cover the American entry into World War II. So up to this point, the United States was technically neutral, although it was very clear that the United States favored it's pretty clear that they favored the Allies. And we know this through various speeches and addresses given by President Roosevelt, but we also know this because of the Lend-Lease Act, which supplied money and vehicles to the Allied powers. They weren't giving them away, they were leasing them. So it wasn't technically a violation of any treaty or anything. So they were kind of stretching the rules and not breaking them. But it was pretty clear that the United States favored the Allies. But they didn't get involved in the war any more than simply helping them where they could. This changes as we look at the Pacific. So most of our attention has been on Europe up to this point, and that's because Japan has pretty much eliminated any threats to them in East Asia. So they have a very firm grasp on China, Korea, parts of Southeast Asia, most of the islands in the Pacific. Japan has eliminated most threats in the East Asian sphere. So they start to look further away. And they decide that the American Pacific Fleet stationed in Pearl Harbor is the next most immediate threat. And so on December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. And this draws the Americans into the war. The next day, on the 8th, the United States declares war on Japan. From what I understand, Hitler was pretty furious at this because this was not at all part of his plan. He did not want to fight the Americans, at least not at this point. From what I understand, he wanted to try to negotiate the Americans to stay out of the war. They wanted the Americans to stay out, or way down the line, maybe go to war with the United States after everything in the Eastern Hemisphere was quiet. So this really upended all of Hitler's plans. I think Hitler was assuming that the Japanese would go after Australia, which would be fine because Hitler was already at war with the British. But in any event, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor and it draws the United States into the war. The United States, at first, focuses mostly on the Pacific, which makes sense because they've gone to war with Japan and they've only declared war on Germany and Italy as an afterthought. So the United States focuses mostly on the Pacific, which really annoys the European allies because they need help right now. But on the other hand, the Chinese are really happy because now someone is helping them. And for the record, this is when the United States finally repeals the Chinese Exclusion Act and allows Chinese immigration back to the United States. Basically, what the Americans do in the Pacific is they use this strategy called island hopping. And it's a very simple strategy. The Americans would land on an island and force the Japanese off of it. Build an airstrip and hop to the next island closer to Japan. And that was the American strategy. That's what they did. And this pretty much lasted from 1942 all the way up to 1945. So that's pretty much what the Americans were doing. Finally, in 1943, the Americans and the British invade Italy. They knew that the Italians were unhappy with Mussolini. That none of this stuff was anything that most Italians had signed up for, and they were really unhappy with what Mussolini was doing. And so the Allies believed they could convince the Italians to leave the war. And as soon as they invade, and they invade from the south and they go up to the north, Italians some Italians defect and start fighting against the Germans. In late 1943, Mussolini is overthrown. Mussolini is overthrown. Let's say words the correct way. He's overthrown and thrown in jail. And the Germans come and rescue him and put him back in charge. So at this point, Italy looks like France in that the Germans are deciding what is going to happen in Italy now. So Mussolini is technically in charge, but he's just following orders from Germany at this point. He's no longer really in charge of Italy. The Italian invasion draws enough Germans away from France to launch an invasion there. And this is the famous D-Day invasion. And this happens on June the 6th, 1944. So American and British and Canadian soldiers invade German-occupied France. So if you've ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, this is what you see at the very beginning of that movie. So this is a very, very deadly invasion, and a lot of people die, but it's successful enough that the Allies now have a foothold in France. And at this point, it's just a matter of time until the Germans are forced to surrender. So the British and the Americans come from the West, and the Soviets push from the East, and they surround Germany. And Hitler commits suicide on April the 30th, 1945, and that pretty much marks the end of the war, at least in Europe. In all of these invasions, Mussolini tries to escape, but he's arrested and executed. And that happens on April the 28th, 1945. I'm not sure if Hitler knew about that before he took his own life. Probably not. So, at this point, the only part of the war that's still continuing is the war in the Pacific. So, in February of 1945, so before Germany finally surrenders, the leaders of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union met at Yalta. Yalta is a resort town in Ukraine in the Soviet Union. And at this meeting, they decide how the war would end. It was clear at this point that the war was going to be won in their favor, and so they want to decide how the war would end. So they make a couple of decisions. They decide to keep fighting until Germany and Japan both surrender unconditionally. And for the record, Stalin had not declared war on Japan yet, so Stalin declares war on Japan, hoping to take some of the Chinese territory that the Japanese had taken. So he was doing this to look like he's helping, but he also had selfish goals, just like he had selfish goals when he signed the non-aggression pact with the Nazis to get half of Poland. So Stalin declares war on Japan at this point. So the war in the Pacific continues. While all of that was going on, secretly, American and British scientists, German scientists, and Soviet scientists were all racing to create nuclear weapons. For the Americans, this was known as the Manhattan Project. And so to force the Japanese to surrender, the Americans dropped 2 nuclear weapons, first on Hiroshima on August the 6th, 1945, and on Nagasaki on August the 9th, 1945. The next day, Japan surrenders. There are a couple of theories as to why the Americans decided to use these nuclear weapons. One was to show off to the rest of the world, look at what we've got, don't mess with us. Pretty much pointing at the Soviets. But The other idea is that estimates of the death toll of an actual physical invasion of Japan would have cost hundreds of thousands of lives, possibly millions of lives. And this was regrettably the most humane solution because Japan probably would not have surrendered otherwise. So this marks the end of World War II and the only time that nuclear weapons have ever been used in a war. Now, almost immediately after this, the Allies begin to argue about what to do next. And this pretty much marks the beginning of the Cold War, which will set up the last really big topic in the courses. So we'll stop there. The next video we do in this series will be on the Holocaust and ethnic cleansing. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.